Good evening or good morning, wherever you may be. My name is Andrew Benjamin, and I'm going to try and read a lecture for the Benjamin Conference. I'm going to show a PowerPoint which will have within it, I think, the key quotations I'm going to use. I've not actually read a lecture before, but because this is slightly on Zoom, because this is slightly complex, I am going to stick to my text. Let me now just share the screen, and so you can see the PowerPoint. In which you have the title. And let me just explain a little bit about the project. I'm writing a slightly longer piece that starts with Cassirer on myth, looks at Benjamin on the relationship between myth and law, and finishes with a longer section on the question of the future. What I'm going to do today is present a very brief summary of the Cassirer work, and then move into again a summary version of the Benjamin piece, and leave the discussion of the future out, as it were. So this is the overall title of the project. So and what I've done is, for the important quotes, I've put them in a slide. So you'll probably see typographical infelicities in at least 2 languages, which I apologize. So let me begin. These notes, which arise in the context of a slightly larger project, follow on from a critical account of Ernst Cassirer's writings on myth, specifically his analysis of its modern form as it appeared in his book, The Myth of the State. One of the conclusions to be drawn from the engagement with Cassirer is that the strength of his analysis lies in his commitment to an examination of myth which, while accounting for its origins, allows its limitations to be drawn. An edge condition is established. He argues that even though, and I quote, myth remains irrational in its content, it is very clearly conscious of its aims, end quote. The challenge for Cassirer that is presented by myth is that, and again I quote, it is in a sense invulnerable. It is impervious to rational arguments. It cannot be refuted by syllogisms, end quote. For Cassirer, the necessity of a critique of myth lay in its transformation, one traced initially through the writings of Carlyle on the hero, which occurred as a result of the incorporation of myth into the writing of particular histories, and then the promulgation of contemporary political activity that established and then sought to maintain racial division. While myth was initially in the service of what might be described as world history or universal history, its modern configuration cannot be separated from the creation of racialized subject positions, which were constructed to vilify while establishing differing forms of sovereignty. Modern myth had a particular project, which was for Cassirer pitted against the projected universality associated with both Kant and Neo-Kantianism. Moreover, the addition of the term modern is important in that it allows myth to have a history while simultaneously occasioning retrospective interpretations within that history. In Cassirer's terms, modern myth was deployed, and again I quote, as an attempt to destroy all other values, end quote. For Cassirer, what this means is that while myth has a link to the symbol and thus to the aesthetic, in the modern period, myth had lost its aesthetic force. In Cassirer's larger set of writings on art and the aesthetic, he described both in terms of production and thus the production of aesthetic form. He then adds that, and I quote, this production depends upon specific autonomous acts of the human mind, end quote. These acts have a universalizing force. Myth is the expression of emotion. It is not the emotion itself, hence it has a symbolic register that necessitates or engages universal subjectivity. There is a freedom, both in expression and in its reception. The aesthetic depends upon a sense of freedom. Here is the problem. While myth can be accounted for in terms of its use to create and sustain structures of unfreedom, it cannot be countered by the simple assertion of freedom as autonomy. Such a move fails to take the work of myth into consideration. Excluded as a result is the service to which myth is put, and thus in what service myth appears. As a result, there has to be another response. The value here of Benjamin's writings, twofold. Firstly, Benjamin is concerned with the work of myth as establishing a regulative economy which inscribed within it an indebted subjectivity, a subjectivity that oscillates between debt and guilt mediated by fate. In other words, myth does not stand in relation to subjectivity, it constructs it differentially. For Cassirer, that also occurs. However, it does so in the name of a form of universality that is simply assumed, assumption as part of a process of naturalization. This is where the second aspect of Benjamin's approach to myth arises. Integral to it is the creation of openings that result from what will be described as the suspension of myth, the undoing of its assumed neutrality. It is in terms of suspension that it will then become possible to develop a conception of the future. So in the longer project, you can see how, and I'll try and show, how an argument for the future depends upon the suspension of the interplay of guilt, debt, and fate, mediated by the presence of myth. The limitation inherent in Cassirer's account of myth is one that paves the way to Walter Benjamin's engagement with myth. In Benjamin's Theories of German Fascism, a text written at least 14 years after the Critique of Violence, the latter is the text that will orientate this lecture, Benjamin, in his review of Junger's edited collection, Krieg und Krieger, links the possibility of the future to the overcoming of myth and magic. Benjamin writes, in relation to the essays comprising the book, that, I quote Benjamin, until Germany has broken through the entanglement of such Medusa-like beliefs that confront it in these essays, the essays in Junger's book, it cannot hope for a future. Perhaps the word loosened would be better than broken through. And I'm interested in this structure of breaking through, of loosening. I see here a reiteration of the project of the destructive character that picks up on the use of the word caesura that occurs throughout Benjamin's writings. I think there's a constellation of terms all pointing in a similar direction. Now, in regards to this particular quotation, this Medusa-like belief, these Medusa-like beliefs are described earlier in the same text, and I quote, as the metaphysical abstractions in which the new nationalism believes. And note here the emergence of a form of belief. It's very important that we see that nationalism and myth are bound up with belief. This generates a sense of war, in which war, and I quote Benjamin again, is nothing other than the attempt to redeem mystically and without mediation the secret of nature, understood idealistically through technology. End quote. Here, technology, in its creation of gas warfare, was the impossibility of maintaining any real distinction between the civilian and the military, which, as Benjamin points out, and I quote, is the most important principle of international law, end quote. As a result of technological innovation, therefore, that distinction, the distinction between the military and the civilian, I quote Benjamin, is abolished. This particular undoing demands its own response. Now, introduced here are a number of central formulations. If references to Medusa-like beliefs and the mystical can be taken as marking the presence of myth, and again, it is not myth as though all that mattered were terms, it is myth as having an operative presence, thus the work of myth as constructing both identities and differences, then overcoming myth and the current forms of enchantment, when taken together, comprise the precondition for there being any hope for the future, and thus are other forms of life. Futurity and as the world's re-enchantment have to be thought together. It is possible to go further and define futurity in precisely these terms, as premised on that breaking through. While the language is different, what is identified here by the use of the formulation breaking through is one of the central concepts being developed in the critique of violence, namely göttliche Gewalt, or divine violence. The next important element to be noted in the passage from Theories of German Fascism is the reference to the law. The limitation of international law, in a sense, its failure to regulate, its having been rendered inoperative by the developments in technology, necessitates that law no longer be taken as given. There is therefore a further exigency. What emerges is the demand for a sustained investigation of the structures, the very structures within which law is thought. It is vital to underscore what is at play. Law lacked a coercive force to restrict the development of that which rendered a fundamental tenet of international law inoperative. Once this position allows for forms of generality, then the law, in the guise of a set of constructed or posited statutes, coterminous with a corresponding set of norms, would only ever be constrained to emerge after the event, in order then to engage or not with those events that had already rendered it inoperative in the first place. What this means, again as a generalized claim, is that the force of law can no longer be located within prevailing norms. If law has deontological force, then it cannot be extrapolated from the simple presence of normativity. An opening emerges at this precise point. One direction leads to the argument that what retains the centrality, one direction leads to the argument that retains the centrality and inevitability of a conception of conflict articulated within and as disequilibria of power. Within that setting, decisions emerge as the result of policing, violence, and war. Here there is a flight from any sense of accord, any sense of coexistence. Its opposite is equally a form of retreat. Rather than the pragmatism of war and conflict thus construed, in which questions of sovereignty are resolved in terms of the possession of political power, there is a move to a transcendental conception of the good. At one extreme, however, this becomes a form of Gnosticism, in which the world is then bereft of any possibility of enchantment. the way through the dilemma of pragmatism, of a pragmatism that sustains violence on the one hand, and a transcendentalism that is constrained to devalue the world on the other, is located in the claim that pragmatic acts and events, in addition, the decision itself, are judgeable. In other words, it is not just a play of forces without value, and in which what matters is strength, nor are particulars, pragmatic instances, rendered meaningful as a result of the presence of forms or ideas. Neither position holds. It is rather that they are judgeable because they bring with them the universal in relation to which they can be judged. Judgments, which are contestable, then ensue. The possibility of judgment is that which makes actions, events, and decisions meaningful. If this position can be assumed, then what follows is there must be that which attends normativity and which allows for the judgment, allows for the interplay of judgment and meaning, and yet which is at the same time not coextensive with any one set of prevailing norms. What attends normativity is therefore in excess of it. In addition, that excess, as the possibility of judgment, can always be refused or denied. As a result, there needs to be a defense of both judgment and its possibility. Now, the problems resulting from this configuration of judgment and meaning, it will be argued, are in part those with which Benjamin is engaged in the closing pages of the Critique of Violence. Now, this is my position. This is the position I want to defend throughout in what follows. So to state the position in advance, that which is there in excess of normativity's complex relation to the law is what will be termed law's constancy. Law's constancy is the constancy of law's opening to the possibility of unconditional justice. There is a politics implicit in the presence of the unconditioned, but only, and this is the response one makes, or I would want to make, to both Derrida and to Kant, but especially to Derrida. There is a politics here, but only if the term constancy is emphasized. It is this constancy that entails the possibility of action. While what counts as unconditional justice can be defined, integral to the understanding of it as unconditional is that which is precluded by such a definition, is that what is precluded by such a definition, the retention of the notion of the unconditional, what it precludes is the possibility of a setting or an event in which or to which the question of justice does not apply. So the unconditional is bound up with the fact that at every moment the question of justice can be asked. There isn't one in relation to which you say, well, in this instance, we don't ask it. The project to be pursued throughout the following is the possibility of recovering a conception of law's constancy from Benjamin's own engagement with the law in the Critique of Violence. The supposition is that what makes the project possible is the continual oscillation in Benjamin's writings between law, Recht, and justice, Gerechtigkeit. This needs the additional point that this occurs in conjunction with his very real concern with the just life. As a methodological note, central to this overall project is to reposition Benjamin not just as a philosopher of life, but one for whom life can only be thought in terms of its relation to the law. Here, of course, for me, is the register of a counter-political theology. The reintroduction of the relationship between law and life is predicated on an undoing of any form of universal subjectivity defined in terms of either faith or belief. That universality was only ever putative, since it was always constrained to establish the non-believer, or those deemed as without faith, or those constructed such that their faith was actually another form of faith. It is important to note at the outset both the interpretive difficulties of the critique of violence, as well as the range and significance of the already existing published commentaries. Taken together, they present real challenges for writing yet again on this text. In a sense, the notes, and they're just provisional notes, offered below can be read as complementing the already extraordinary work done by both Werner Hammacher, Massimiliano Tomba, and Judith Butler, amongst others. This becomes especially clear in relation to the formulation used by Benjamin when he writes of der Entsetzung des Rechts, the suspension of the law. Though it should be noted in advance that Benjamin, that Benjamin will use an array of terms to signal a similar state of affairs. The passage with which a beginning will be made here provides one of these moments. Writing of divine violence, Benjamin states that, and I quote, "This divine violence is not only attested by religious tradition, but is also found in present life, in at least one sacred manifestation. The educative power, which in its perfected form stands outside the law, is one of its manifestations." And you have to note here the reiteration of the word Gewalt as oscillating between violence and power. Law in this passage refers as much to a set of prevailing statutes as it does the equation of law with the demands of normativity. From the perspective of the argument to be advanced here, normativity can only refer to the naturalization of the abstract conditions that determine value at the present. Hence the term law, while having a strict definition given by the relation to the judicial system, will be allowed greater extension. What it means, therefore, to be outside the law is not a literal claim concerning the presence of either statutes or the common law tradition. The outside in question is the creation of a setting that, while having a relation to the given, is not determined by the interplay of normativity and the law, where the latter is understood judicially. The question to be asked, of course, is why does education, at least in its sacred manifestation, have such a relation to the law? And just as an aside, I would note that one would, in analyzing this passage in much greater detail, which I can't do, the description of this manifestation as sacred would be the fundamental point of departure. Now, the answer to this question hinges on the way that education has a twofold power. And again, the translation of Gewalt in terms of power, rather than the English word violence, is a prerequisite here. In the first instance, it is the power to resist both the determination of the state, which is the demand that education functions in completely utilitarian terms, where the latter, the utility in question, is defined by the continual naturalization of the sovereignty of the state, or Staatsgewalt. So we have a distinction on the level of Gewalt. Utility in this context engenders a belief in the project of state sovereignty. Again, belief and faith work together. The second is that education has the power, though only in its sacred manifestation, to open up an investigation and an eventual promulgation of histories and values that are not those of normativity. It must always be remembered that normativity is not an end in itself. It should be understood as the naturalization of state power working in conjunction with the logic of capital. And in the present predicament, the predicament in which we find ourselves, also in conjunction with the logic of carbon. So the power of education as cessation or a redirection, cojoined to an opening up of questions to which answers were already assumed, has the quality of violence insofar as it undoes the configuration of norms, naturalized and thus thought inviolate, within which life is structured in advance. If this educative power is an instance of divine violence, an instant of it as an operative presence, then while there is an undoing, thus a form of suspension, there is always that which is retained and which will be reconfigured in the openings that this form of violence creates. Now, untouched by this violence is what Benjamin refers to as the soul of the living, die Seele des Lebendigen. However, the question to be addressed has to concern the quality of this life, quality in its ontological sense. What is life here? The link between education in its sacred manifestation and the soul, Seele, of the living needs to be noted. The contention remains that what is emerging is both the possibility of thinking life in its relation to law's constancy and the opening of another political theology. It should not be surprising in regard to this latter point that terms such as sacred and soul form part of a constellation that includes law. The point would be that both terms allude to the law, in that both will depend for their defense on law's constancy. They are positioned as much beyond the confines of fate as they are of any definition of subjectivity in terms of faith and belief. As the argument progresses, Benjamin concedes that this proposed undoing of the differing permutations taken by the interplay of law and normativity, undone by their denaturalization, and thus incorporation into the temporality of transformation and suspension, the only temporality that harbors the future by its having been made a condition of the present, this may prompt a concomitant response, precisely because belief and faith construct subject positions defined by modes of policed inclusion and exclusion. The undoing of such a setting may result in a genuinely violent response. Resistance to divine violence may involve letale Gewalt, lethal power. There is on Benjamin's part the recognition of the possibility of a literally violent defense of law and normativity. Benjamin's encounter with this position gives rise to another complex argument. And it's an argument that I still struggle to understand, I have to say. The point of departure is noting that the response to this literal violence may be withdrawal or pacifism. Neither, for Benjamin, is an effective countermeasure. Hence the need to respond. Firstly, the refusal to kill is not based on a judgment, but on the presence of a guideline provided by the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." It is a guideline because there are exceptions, for example, self-defense. However, countering the position that justifies an opposition to killing by invoking the sanctity of life is equally as mistaken. The argument advanced by Benjamin here is introduced by refusing the claim that existence, Dasein, is higher than either Glück or Gerechtigkeit, happiness or justice. The introduction at this point of justice is central. Benjamin continues thus in one of these extraordinary passages. The proposition that existence stands higher than a just existence is false and ignominious if existence is to mean nothing other than mere life. And it has this meaning in the argument referred to. It contains a mighty truth, and again, note the reiteration of the word Gewalt. However, if existence, or better life, means the irreducible total condition that is man, if the proposition is tended to mean that the non-existence of man is something more terrible than the admittedly subordinate, not yet attained condition of the just man. Now, the position being advanced in the opening line of this passage is not a simple opposition between existence and just existence. It is rather that existence is already a form of particularization within a network of relations. Existence, therefore, is already marked by the possibility that there may be a form of life that prevails, and it could be mere life. It is essential to be clear here. The term mere in mere life marks specific content. The equation of life with mere life results from the construction of those whose form of life can be stripped of any other quality other than their bodily presence. The stripping in question produces neither literal bareness nor nudity because it always leaves a mark on those bodies. These bodies cannot be bare. They bear the mark. As part of the process of the production of mere life, necessitates something in addition. It necessitates the creation of settings in which that form of life is housed and constrained. Police cells, concentration camps, locales created by processes of extrajudicial extraction, border zones, etc., with their concomitant policed activity, create structures sustaining mere life. Another essential element is that the possibility of the equation of a form of life with mere life
whether understood on the level of the individual or produced collectivities, endures as a threat. That threat also has a policing effect. The additional point is that precisely because there is a threat, there are equally those who are unthreatened or who remain oblivious to its possibility. Benjamin's overall position in this regard is clear. While mere life as a form of life is always that which is created, human being is not the same as mere life. And again, I would argue there's a notion of excess built into this, and an ineliminable and original excess. Human being does not coincide with mere life. Rather, the possibility of mere life is there as a continual threat to human being. And yet for Benjamin, there is nothing sacred in the human condition that stands opposed to mere life. The human can be killed. There has to be more to life than that which is provided by the history of humanism. Understanding what is at stake necessitates returning to the section of the text, to the opening section of the text cited here. Just existence is higher than mere existence, than mere life. But existence is higher than the just life if existence is equated with what Benjamin describes as, and I quote, the total condition that is man. Hence the complex last part of the sentence. What human being has is the capacity for the just life. That is, the life defined in relation to justice. Note here the temporality and ontology of constancy. Constancy as indicating the necessity of potentiality, and thus a recasting of human being in terms of a continual potentiality to be. As a result, what the term just indicates in this context is not the presence of an extraneous and thus contingent predicate. In a sense, it defines what is sacred within human being. The sacred, while always there, is precarious. The non-existence of human being is to be equated with the non-existence of that which has the continual possibility, the potentiality of living justly. Hence the ambiguity of the formulation, excuse me, the not yet attained condition of the just man. And I would just say parenthetically, this is a line I've wrestled with for years. On the one hand, such a proposition can be understood as holding to the presence of just as an arbitrary or contingent quality. Equally, however, it can be read as containing the truth of human being, namely the capacity for the as yet to be attained quality of justice that attends human being when what is considered, to use Benjamin's formulation, is the total condition that is man. At the heart of that condition, there is the potentiality to be. This is, of course, the definition of human being in terms of laws constantly. So it's not just the potentiality to be full stop. It's the potentiality to be where being is living justly. So there is, if you like, an identification of the ethical within the ontological. In my work, I describe this as the presence of virtue in being. And to my mind also, I just say, if there is a Benjaminian inflected political theology, then it occurs at precisely this moment. And the decisive element is the link between, in my language, the potentiality to be and law's constancy. At work here is a splitting of the term sacred. If there is nothing sacred in the condition of human being, what gives specificity to human being? There are two paths. In the first, what is often taken to be sacred is nothing other than the life of guilt, the guilty life, fated being. And again, there is an economy here. The logic of debt and guilt, while allowing for moments of cessation, is always met by the necessity of its own renewal. That economy may contain its ebbs and flows. What endures, however, is the necessity of its own reiteration. Cycles of law-making and law-preserving comprise the endless repetition of normativity, what might be described as their eternal return. This setup is maintained by what Benjamin describes as mythic forms of law. This is the cycle that has to be broken. There are two decisive passages in the text here. In the first instance, Benjamin notes, on the breaking of this circulation under the spell of mythic legal forms, on the suspension of the law with all the violences on which it depends as they depend on it, finally, therefore, on the abolition of state power, a new historical epoch is founded. And again, there isn't time to really unpack this formulation. Just let me note. While the details of this passage warrant its own exacting commentary, it is clear that futurity is linked to the undoing of the economy sustained by legal spells. Equally, that undoing, as already noted, is the precondition for the future. It provides the future's definition. The suspension of the law is the refusal for what occurs, the day-to-day, to be defined in terms of prevailing logic. The prevailing logics. At this point, the lines with which the text ends need to be introduced. Divine violence, which is the sign and seal, but never the means of sacred dispatch, may be called sovereign violence. Part of the difficulty of this passage can be found in the description of divine violence as Valtenda. Now, the first English translation, which is the one on the screen, used the term sovereign. The new translation uses the term pending. Now, it's not a question of my saying one's right, one's wrong, or that either is right or both are wrong, whatever it may be. I'm not interested in that per se. There's something interesting, however, going on if one traces, does a bit of philological work on the history of the term. The term appears in many places in the history of German philosophy, both in German and in accompanying Latin translations. The term appears in a number of places to describe the attendant presence of either reason, Vernunft, or the soul. This occurs in the writings of Giordano Bruno. In Bruno, the word marks what might be described as an attending power. It's neither pending nor sovereign, rather it is an attending power. And it is both. It can't be merely that which is attends, that which is there. It must, the notion of the power must be inscribed back in. It's an attending power. It's a power, therefore, that prevails. Thus, it is always pending. Divine violence is a pending power. The important element here is that it is a power whose actualization awaits. What awaits attends, it prevails. At work here is the weak messianism that Benjamin identifies elsewhere. And so the word here, Waltenda, gestures towards, if you like, the possibility of an awaiting that is linked to the actualization of a power. Hence the wonderful line that at any moment the Messiah may walk through the straight gate, means that the straight gate awaits. A certain constellation of terms emerge here: attending, potentiality, not yet being, which when taken together delimit a sense of the future that depends upon activity understood as actualizations. Those actualizations incorporate and allow for forms of life and modes of subjectivization. These incorporations can be both understood and judged. This does not occur because of the positing of the universality of human being, even though it would be a spurious form of universality based on either faith or belief, but as a result of the constant possibility of the just life, a possibility that can be judged and understood as a result of both the anoriginality of law's constancy and the repositioning of the relationship between life and the just life in terms of the potentiality to be. Thank you very much.